Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Sentinel Command Group podcast. Today, we're going to talk about something that most companies probably feel like they have under control, but they really don't. And really, that boils down to the decision making governance of their policies, their protocols, their practices. We're not going to talk about operational items. We're not going to say operationally, here's what companies should do. No, what we're talking about is after a decision has been made, and then depending on where that decision has led the company, it could be a successful operation. It could be that there were some errors made and there's room for improvement. And it could be some disastrous situation as well. So we're just going to look at the different components of a decision making experience and how that experience has led a company down a particular road. We're not talking about, like I said, now operations. We're not talking about strategy as it relates to operations, and we're not talking about performance metrics and things like that. There are metrics that you can have for decision making, but we're not going to talk about those necessarily in depth today. Governance, specifically, we're talking about how decisions are structured, who has the authority to make that decision, and when does escalation occur at the company. For instance, when does a decision go above that current deciding person's ability, or really because they're not authorized to make that decision? When does that decision escalate? And then how we escalate and formulate and justify and accept the decision in documented ways. In other words, is there policy that says, here's how a decision is made, here's who makes it, and here's why? We don't have to go to detail. You don't have to really have a lot of detail on why. The key here is that the decision making should be just documented well enough that in the future you can reference it and you know exactly what happened, because that's how the policy is written and that's how the protocol occurs. Really, that distinction matters more than most leaders realize. Is they don't understand the importance behind the decision making documentation, the process protocol documentation. So anyhow, let's get let's get down into the nitty gritty here. Most organizations believe that they make good decisions, which they probably do. There's probably no issues in their decision making process, which is perfect. That operationally, that just means they have decision making down pat and they're performing very well. That means they've hired good, talented leaders. They've built capable teams. They respond quickly to all the challenges that come with decision making and their product development, and marketing, and their services that they have. They're doing a great job. But what we always like to say in governance is, but what about if a board member or the public or the media walk into the company and say, how was that decision made? And it was something that was done 6 months ago. It wasn't something that was just done. We're talking about something that was done 6 months ago. Could companies clearly state, or could they clearly tell the review person, the review committee? It might be a review committee. It could be a congressional review committee, like what Boeing went through with that 737 MAX incident and events. It could be congressional, and you're in front of a panel, and they're asking the question, how was a decision made? Um, and you have to reflect back and try and remember and recall how that decision was made. It's not necessarily a good process and not necessarily a good way to justify what you did, especially under a circumstance where everything was successful, because success is one component of success. Um, the other component is how you arrived and how you got there. Were escalation thresholds triggered? And if so, how were they triggered? And what happened after they were triggered? Who accepted the overall risk of the decision, whatever that decision might have been? And what alternate alternative decisions were made, how these decisions were documented when they were made. These are all very important elements of the whole process of decision making, because operational success can also mask the way decisions are made. In other words, when we have a successful operation, uh, the actual governance behind the decision making, well, that's really not important. We were successful, things are good, we're fine. And then it really is fine until it gets challenged later. Or somebody just wants to know, a board member may just want to know. And you're going to the leader will be left wondering and not looking as strong as they were when it was under an operational umbrella. Uh, really, that question when it comes about how the decision was made, or somebody questioning just some part of it, that's when governance really becomes visible, whether you have it or you don't. Decision making governance is not necessarily about slowing an organization down. We're not trying to slow the process, we're not trying to um, hinder forward momentum. Actually, it speeds it up because everybody already knows what's going to happen, who's going to do it, and when they're going to do it. The decision will be made at a identified level. It's written in policy, which means they have the authorization to make the decision. They're also accepting the risk of that decision, and everybody knows it, and it's all good. And also, something that maybe CEOs or high level executives may not realize, they're trying to, in some cases, not all, but in some cases, are probably trying to do a little plausible deniability issue. But what they're actually doing is hindering a better successful outcome, and they are preventing better services and product, because if somebody is truly responsible for that decision and that responding result of the decision, they're probably going to make it better than if they have that plausible deniability. Because under plausible deniability, they can always say, well, it's not going to come back on me. So yeah, just go ahead and do that, ABC product or whatever, or go ahead and use that piece of equipment. Yeah, go ahead and use it. I got plausible deniability. They'll actually think the decision through and make a better product and make a better service to the customer. So it's something to think about. Really, when it boils down to it, it's all about clarity anyhow. So clarity of who is authorized to make a decision, who is when a decision was escalated to the proper level, who has accountability for the decision, and where is it documented that this is how it works and this is what happened. So it's not just as important to have the process documented, it's also important to have the actual decision documented in some way. So as it's made, it's documented, which either will identify a fault in the decision making process, or it will further justify and support the process decision making method. Excuse me. Strong governance policy on decision making should answer some questions as well. It should answer, who is the defined decision maker? So now we're talking about a policy in place or a protocol in place, and it's being practiced and it's being used. The questions that it should already answer is, who is the defined owner of that decision? In other words, what, not a person, but a position. People change, positions get filled and emptied and vacated and for different reasons. So you don't want to have to change that policy over and over and over again because the name changes of the person. You want a position that makes that decision. What level of financial, regulatory, or safety exposure triggers an escalation? So here are the triggers, and you're not going to be able to list them all, but you get a good rough idea. Here are the situations where this decision will go from here to here. If you're a decision maker and you are needing to get the approval of your supervisor or your boss or the next level, however you want to word it, you're not the right person to make the decision. A decision maker has to be able to make the decision because they own it. They have the responsibility, they have the authority. They don't need the approval. Don't confuse approval with notification, though. If you have to make a decision, but you have to notify somebody that you made it, that's different. That's fine. You're at the right level of decision making. But if you say, okay, I want to do A, B, and C, but hang on, I got to get authorization from my supervisor before we can move forward, then you're not the person making the decision. And again, we fall into that plausible deniability realm. We don't want the plausible deniability position to be making the decision because you've lost all risk control, accountability, responsibility, all that goes out the window. And really, the company becomes responsible in some way, shape, or form. And that's never a good look. We also want to look, when does the discretion end? Where is risk formally acknowledged? And how is the rationale preserved behind making that decision? These are just some of the things that you look at when forming a policy or protocol about decision making. Without those elements, decisions are often made correctly, but they're made informally. And when you have something that's made informally, you can't justify it later because odds are you're not going to be able to remember it. And you're not going to be able to prove that certain things happen because it's all done by memory. And guess what? The person that has the memory of that decision may be gone. They may no longer be with the company. So informality creates ambiguity, and ambiguity is not a good look for a company. Ambiguity becomes exposure, and exposure becomes liability. These are things that you want to avoid in the company for disastrous outcomes. All right, so let's look at something that's maybe a little bit more uncomfortable, and that is the internal bias. When organizations write their own governance policies, several predictable dynamics occur. For instance, you have optimism bias. Um, and that is, we already handle these things properly. We're good. We're solid. We're fine, which is a very dangerous bucket to be in as a company. You never want to think that, okay, we're perfect, we're fine, we got everything under control. That's usually when you're going to get an error, when something's going to happen. We also have cultural bias. This is very common. This is the way we've always done it, so that's the way we're going to do it. There's several case studies out there that can show you that this is the way we've always done it, so we're fine, is not a very good position for a company to be in. We have hierarchical sensitivity. Um, we don't want to define escalation too rigidly. We don't want to push too much work on that upper level person or that higher level person. Um, and then we have reputation defensiveness, where um, we don't want to document something too much because that could be damaging later. Well, if you're worried about that, that means you're not making the right decision anyhow. And really none of this is malicious. It's all just kind of truths behind the internal corporate bias that we have. It's only human, but we also have to look at, why can't we do this internally? Because the person that's reviewing your decision making policies, procedures, practices may be somebody going, oh, that decision, I really like doing that. I'm going to make sure that I'm the one responsible and I can make the decision on that. That bias is what can actually get a company into trouble later. That's why it's always beneficial to have a third party review these decision matters, because they're not going to have that impression. They're not going to say, oh, I really like that guy over there, so I want him to make the decision, or I really like that, so I'm going to make the decision and put it in policy. So that also could be a dangerous situation for a company to be in. Creating that distance in the development of your decision making process, policies, and procedures, it just creates clarity. Uh, Defining who's doing what and when, It really does. Just it creates a good, clear picture, and as long as you're following it, and then you're documenting as it happens that you're following your procedures, it's solid and it's defensible later. That's It's just so important to have that independent governance review it, it, to make sure that that is solid. Also, um, there's a couple reasons why you want third party reviewers. One is just the neutrality that I talked about. There's no buy in to helping a specific person um, make a decision or be responsible for something. There's no negative internal politics behind it. It just works. And then there's structural analysis. Um, if you're trying to determine if a decision was made correctly, you don't want the person that made the decision to be the one that's reviewing it, because what are they going to say? Obviously, they're going to say, "Yeah, I did this, and yeah, it was the right decision." You need that third party neutral overseer, reviewer to say, "Okay, yeah, this person made the decision. Operationally, everything went fine, but this decision really needs to be made at this level or in this from this position over here, not over there." And then we have to test the escalation process. A lot of times, a third party can actually test that and not hurt any feelings, as opposed to an internal reviewer from inside the company reviewing it and saying, "Yeah, um, this decision probably should have been made at the next level because maybe it was my position. Maybe I was the one making the decision. I don't want to say, yeah, my boss should have made it, not me." It makes me kind of look weak. So we really shouldn't have an internal person reviewing our decision making process. They should be a resource to the third party doing the review, but they should not be the ones making the review or doing the review. There's just too much internal politics and too much internal bias that goes on in having it done inside. Um, it's just too important to review the framework and make sure that you're supported properly and defensible later to uh, have it done from the inside. If we look at, we could look at a couple real world examples. Actually, let me look at a couple things here. Um, so we have a, the decision. Let's see. I'm not going to look at that one. I don't want to do that. Yeah, if we look at I've done some case studies. I've done a couple of them. One of them's ongoing right now with Norwegian Cruise Lines. The other one was the Boeing 737 Max. And the result of, for instance, the Boeing one, it's all public record. I'm not divulging any insider information. It's all established from the public records that are available. But if we look at the Boeing situation, in a nutshell, Boeing had a unit that was reviewing the 737 Max product for the FAA. So the FAA says, hey, we will allow you to review the product and go through our approval requirements. Basically, approve it yourself. Not a good concept. Unfortunately, through the congressional hearings, they did divulge and not divulge, but they did uncover that this was the process, and it was approved by the FAA. And they've since still kept that same process, which I'm not sure if it's good or bad that they kept it, but they've removed the unit that's going to review the product, even though it's a unit from the company, in this case, Boeing. The unit that's reviewing the product is separate from the Boeing company, but part of the Boeing company. They still review it for the FAA. They just have to make sure that they meet certain criteria. Again, I think it would be better if it was a third party reviewer on the side, like an FAA unit, not necessarily the Boeing or whatever the airline company is that's making the product. They can actually have their own unit reviewing it on behalf of the FAA, as long as the unit goes by certain criteria, which I think is better controlled through the FAA, not through the company, but whatever. So really, under the old system, it was, you're approving your own product. What are you going to do? Yeah, it's ready to go. Especially under that circumstance where, according to the records, they were trying to compete with the Airbus, and therefore there was a timeline, critical timeline that had to be met, and that's what kind of caused the whole pushing it through too fast to get it done, and the pilots training and things like that that went into that whole disaster. And that cost Boeing $18 billion. And if we had the right decision making governance policies in place, and accountability and risk assessment and responsibility, I mean, who's to say that that whole thing couldn't have been avoided? Again, it's the importance of having your decision making process in writing, documented when you make it, and the proper position making the decision. Those are so important. In this case, if you look at the stock, if you look at the open market stock information on Boeing, you can actually see where they still haven't fully recovered. So they're still technically losing money. Um, just, it's crazy. And then we're looking now at Norwegian Cruise Lines, where one of their high level executives has been pushing through improper invoices. Again, this is all public information, nothing that I'm giving up internally. He's pushing through invoices, paying out invoices that really are false and fraudulent, and then splitting the expense made by Norwegian Cruise Lines to this invoiced process that he approved. And there's no checks and balances. There's no proper decision making. That they could probably use a policy review from a third party reviewer as well. Um, it's just, these things cost so much money. Who knows? They're talking a couple $1 million in that one, that fraud scam that occurred. And you know, a lot of companies, especially like with the Boeing situation, how many companies can handle an $18 billion loss? How many companies can handle a $2 million loss, like what they've calculated uh, with the Norwegian Cruise Lines? And then from a political standpoint, you could look at all these states that are having their issues with their grant funding and improper use of grant funds. There's billions of dollars being lost and scammed and stolen and fraudulent use out there. And it's really from poor decision making models and decision making processes that could be better later, could be better now, really, with the proper review. It's just so important to have a third party review. And when it comes down to it, um, you know, we're here to help. My company, Sentinel Command Group, is here to help. Our motto is justify, codify, make. Justify the decision, codify it in policy, procedures, practice, and then make the decision defensible later. So that's what we do. And now that's this version of my Sentinel Command Group podcast. And we are here to help if you guys need it. But there you go. We'll just call that a day. Have a good day, everybody. See you at the next episode.